Today we're talking about House of Cards, the American version. Okay, welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about House of Cards, the American version, how it fell or collapsed like a house of cards. So I'm doing a number of these videos regarding storytelling. I'm focusing on some good examples, but also some frustrating, some poor examples. Now I realize I'm late to this party, but I'm talking about the American version with Kevin Spacey and not the UK version. But more specifically, season 6 of House of Cards. It is frankly dreadful. Now series 1 to 4 were great. I thought they were fabulous. There were a few wobbles in season 5, but then it all collapsed like a house of cards in series 6. Now, I know that matters were complicated by Kevin Spacey being dropped because of the allegations made against him, many or most of which at the time of this video were dropped. But the way season 6 developed was very frustrating. So here is why I think Series 6 failed, and at the end I offer my way of improving it, or how I think it should have finished. And all in all, I hope we can learn something about when we craft stories. So I'm not going to give a full summary of the whole of season 6 and the setup, or the whole series at all, other than to say Kevin Spacey plays a Machiavellian politician, Frank Underwood, who works himself up from a whip in the House of Representatives in the Congress, US Congress, first to the vice presidential position and then to the President of the United States. He is supported by his equally Machiavellian wife, cold, hard-to-read sort of ice queen, Claire Underwood, played very well by Robin Wright, and a super loyal chief of staff called Doug Stamper, played again well by Michael Kelly. Now, the early series were beautifully crafted, acted and paced, and I was binge watching and enjoying it all. As I said, there was a bit of a wobble in season 5, but then it all collapsed on season 6. So the problems with season 6, in no particular order. It ditched the political intrigue. There was no real power struggle with Congress. When in the earlier series it had worked so well, Frank Underwood was an expert on playing the political system. He knew it well, he knew all about the politics, but with Frank Underwood dead, the story changed. And because Claire Underwood didn't have that history with the Congress and dealing with the Congress, and it wasn't clear what her political aims were, what was her political plan, her agenda, it all sort of fell a bit flat. At least Frank Underwood had the America Works project, but with Claire Underwood it was almost power for power's sake. It wasn't going anywhere. Secondly, the lead character. Now, as a character, Claire was sort of cold, icy, but you can't make a lead character about that alone. You need a foil. Who was that foil? Furthermore, it was missing the Frank Underwood's cheekiness and chirpiness. No one had a twinkle in his or her eye. It was all very monotonous. And it did women no favours. There were strong women in the early series. You had Kathy Durant, Heather Dunbar, Jackie Sharp, but they were all sidelined in Series 6. And then Claire Underwood herself brought up the issue of sexism when it had never been discussed, had never been an issue earlier in the series of whether, a woman could hold a position of power. That had never been a problem in the previous series. So she came across as petulant. She opened the door on one occasion to show off a cabinet of women only, when Frank Underwood, her husband, had some really powerful women in his cabinet. And you throw in a few comments like, the reign of the middle-aged white man is over, it just weakened and diminished her character. There was a storyline when some of the other characters were questioning her role as President of the United States, but that was perfectly legitimate because she had been absent from the Oval Office. She'd been in the residential part of the White House for 23, 24 days. So they were perfectly legitimate concerns. And she had never been elected to office. She was only the VP. That was her first time she had been elected to any office. So it wasn't unreasonable for other characters to say she wasn't suitable for office. But she was complaining on behalf of her sex. But you can't have the President of the United States go AWOL for over 3 weeks. So it showed the character of Claire Underwood as remarkably selfish and ill-suited to be POTUS. Yet she would complain when people wouldn't take her seriously. So this was a real shame that it diminished the role and the character of Claire Underwood when there had been so many other good, strong women characters. Next, there were a number of unbelievable scenarios. Now, just a handful as an example. The Kathy Durant Memorial with the President of Russia. There were people wandering in and around this small house, barging into rooms and having meetings. Anybody could barge into any meeting with the US and the Russian presidents. The Secret Service were nowhere to be seen. It had no real sense of the real world about it. The oligarchs and the outside interests. Who were the billionaire shepherds? Why did they have so much power? The question of the power balance between presidents and oligarchs and billionaires was much better done in the earlier series with Donald Tusk. Another small example, but it just bugged me. Doug, the chief of staff, who's sort of semi-retired, enters his apartment to find President Claire Underwood sitting at his kitchen table, and he seemed surprised that she was sitting there. So where were the Secret Service? Shouldn't they have been outside in the corridors of his apartment block or on the streets outside? Where was the entourage of cars? It could hardly be a surprise, and it just wasn't believable. It just seemed too incredible. And at the end of Series 6, there are numerous loose ends, or the endings were nonsensical. Another handful of examples. The death of Tom Yates. Now, Tom Yates was the novelist, the writer who became the lover of Claire Underwood. He had disappeared from the face of the earth, and after 4 months there had been no police investigation. It just didn't seem right. It was well known he had been working in the White House. What about the ex-wife, his ex-wife, who he would regularly see in New York? Hadn't she been asking questions? What about the other lover, the journalist Kate Baldwin? What happened to the book? Who had his laptop? Who had access to his backups? All writers have backups. He would have printout copies. Where were they? Any of it could all bring down Claire Underwood's presidency, but it just wasn't addressed at all. He was kept on ice in a van. It just didn't make sense. Secondly, the hard-hitting journalist Kate Baldwin, another strong woman. Why wasn't she investigating the deaths of 3 of her close colleagues, all dying within days or weeks of each other, and then a 4th a few months later? There was the disappearance of Tom Yates, the novelist, as I just said, who was Kate Baldwin's former lover. Secondly, there was a suicide of Aidan McCallan, the statistics expert that Kate Baldwin had interviewed in Moscow. Thirdly, there was Leanne Harvey, the White House staffer, played by Neve Campbell, who was killed in a car crash. Then there was Tom Hammerschmidt, who was killed a few months later. He had been investigating the Underwoods and had in fact interviewed Frank Underwood. There was the question of who killed Catherine Durant. She wasn't a threat, although she skipped the country. She wasn't a threat. She was shot. Surely that would prompt a police investigation. Her husband, or others, would have nothing to lose, so they could go to the press and expose that something had happened. And the very end itself encapsulated it all. It was a loose end. It was an incredible scenario in the Oval Office. How could a pregnant woman, the President of the United States, overpower a fit male, her former Chief of Staff, Doug Stamper, and kill him? Why didn't the Secret Service burst into the Oval Office? Why didn't she call out to them? And what happened after that? Imagine the fallout from the press, that the President of the United States stabs to death a former Chief of Staff. I mean, it wasn't credible. And also there was this story about the launching on of a nuclear weapon. Did she? How was that dealt with? What happened to the body of Tom Yates itself? Again, nobody was asking these questions. So how should it have been done? Or how would I have liked to it have been done? This is the proposed storyline. Claire Underwood was trying to protect the legacy of her husband, to be supportive of Frank Underwood. But the press, Kate Baldwin, the tough reporter, and also Tom Hammerschmidt, were closing in on the deaths of Zoe Barnes and the disappearance of Rachel Posner, who were being killed by Frank Underwood, or his chief of staff. This additional pressure results in the chief of staff, Doug, taking more desperate measures to cover up as the journalists close in. So the journalists, for instance, could be closing in on the congressman who had also been sort of killed or dispatched by Frank Underwood, but the PA had meetings with Zoe Barnes, so perhaps the journalist could have been closing in on that lead. Doug Stamper is getting increasingly vexed and stressed. He overreaches, he drinks, he makes a slip up. Rachel Posner's body is found. The Zoe Barnes relationship with Frank Underwood is exposed, revealed, perhaps through the use of the phone he had been using, so the pressure is mounting and mounting. And perhaps the women the Underwoods had threatened and manipulated, the whip Jackie Sharp, the Secretary of State Kathy Durant, presidential candidate Heather Dunbar, had joined forces and again applying more and more pressure, and everything begins to unravel. Perhaps Claire Underwood, as president, tries to pick a fight with Russia to create a distraction, but that results in an international incident and the tensions rise further. And so it all ends with the Underwood administration collapsing, maybe just before the midterms. So the Democrats, Claire Underwood is exposed and she's kicked out of office. There's no president, no VP. The Republicans take the House and they take the Senate. So you have a great climax that's been working up from the first series. And it has this moral of the story that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. If you make no friends, then no friends come to your rescue. And Claire becomes increasingly isolated. Think of it a bit like Shakespeare's Macbeth, and Claire is Lady Macbeth. Everything unravels and the wood comes to Dunsinane. So, like Macbeth, they couldn't see the writing on the wall. They thought they were invincible, but then the world marched against them. It was a real shame. It could have been a very dramatic end to the story, but it was not to be. Okay, thank you. Check my other videos out and also check the books, the short stories volumes 1 and 2, and also Nigel has just been released. My Name Was Nigel has just been released, so do check that out as well. Everything's in the description. Do subscribe and support me as you can, share and like, blah blah blah.
davidozeus.uk